He walked into the wrong apartment, and the man already inside let him stay, not out of pity, not out of kindness, out of something neither of them had a name for yet. Aurelian Quill was blind, broke, and holding a lease document that looked completely real, until it wasn't. Someone had taken his money, forged his paperwork, and handed him the keys to the most powerful man in Manhattan's private penthouse. He didn't know that. Not yet. He just knew the floor was marble. The air smelled expensive, and the silence was the kind that only exists when someone is already in the room, watching. Then the voice came, low, controlled, absolute. You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you're in my home. Most people would have run. Aurelian didn't run. And that one decision, standing still in the dark of a stranger's apartment with nothing but a cane and a signed piece of paper, changed both of their lives completely. This is the story of what happened next. The key turned on the first try. That should have been the first sign something was wrong. Aurelian Quill had been expecting resistance. Stiff locks, a sticky door frame, the usual complaint of an aging building that hadn't been properly maintained in years. That was what affordable units in Manhattan felt like. That was the language of every apartment he had ever lived in. This door opened like it was expecting him. Smooth, silent, precise. His cane found the threshold first. Marble. Cool and polished, with none of the grout ridges or soft vinyl that announced a normal apartment floor. He stepped inside, and the sound around him shifted immediately. The rain outside dropped to a whisper. The city noise, sirens, construction, the low constant hum of 10 million people pressing against each other, disappeared entirely. Aurelian stood still for exactly 3 seconds. He did that in unfamiliar spaces, counted, listened, let the room introduce itself before he moved through it. What he heard was almost nothing, and that was wrong. Normal buildings talked, pipes knocked, neighbors argued through thin walls. Elevators groaned between floors. Even at midnight, a typical Manhattan building carried noise the way a body carried blood. Constantly, invisibly, necessarily. This place had none of that. The silence here wasn't absence. It was constructed, engineered. The silence of a space that had been deliberately sealed from the rest of the world. His free hand found the wall beside the door. He ran his fingertips across it and immediately felt the difference. Not drywall. Something smoother, cooler. He pressed gently. The wall didn't flex at all. The air smelled like cedar and something darker underneath it. Not cologne exactly, more like the memory of it. Rich and controlled and faintly cold, the way a room smells when someone powerful has been living in it for a long time. Aurelian lowered his travel bag from his shoulder carefully. He told himself it was fine. The broker had sent him the address twice. He had confirmed it by phone. He had the lease agreement folded into the inner pocket of his jacket, signed and stamped and accompanied by a printed receipt for the deposit he could not fully afford to lose. He had done everything correctly. He always did everything correctly because when you move through the world the way he did, quietly, carefully, without the option of a quick visual scan to catch your errors, correctly was the only option available. The building's name had surprised him when he arrived. 84th floor. A lobby that smelled like fresh flowers and heated stone. A doorman who had looked at his paperwork for a long time before finally waving him through without a word. Aurelian had assumed the man was new. Or tired. Or both. He took 3 steps forward into the apartment. His cane swept gently to the left and connected with something low and solid. He reached down. A side table. Marble top. Heavy base. His hand moved upward and found a vase. Crystal from the weight of it. He released it slowly. This was not a studio apartment. He had paid for a studio apartment. Aurelian pressed forward another 4 steps and his foot found the edge of a rug. White, deeply textured. The kind of rug that cost more than 2 months of his rent. He crouched briefly and pressed his palm against it. He stayed in that position for a moment longer than necessary. Hi viewers, have you ever walked into a place and known immediately, in your bones before a single word was spoken, that something was completely off? Drop in the comments and tell me what that moment felt like for you. He stood back up. His philosophy had always been a simple one. The world was not designed for him. Sidewalks had gaps. Crosswalks had broken signals. Landlords forgot to mention stairs until move-in day. People made promises they didn't keep and errors they didn't acknowledge. And Aurelian had learned years ago that fighting every single one of them was a war with no ending. So he adapted. He adjusted. He found the thing that was usable in every situation and he used it, because exhaustion was real and survival required choices. If the world accidentally gives you something good, don't question it too loudly. He set his violin case down against the wall with practiced care. He located what he believed was the bedroom hallway and moved toward it slowly, cane sweeping in quiet arcs. He had groceries to put away, a charger to find an outlet for, a new space to map in the dark of his own mind, corner by corner, step by step, until it became somewhere he could move through without fear. He was halfway to the hallway when he stopped. Not because of anything his cane found. Because of something else entirely. The silence in the room had changed. It had weight now. A specific kind of weight that silence only gets when it is shared. Aurelian turned his head slightly to the left. His chin lifted a fraction. He held his breath. The air moved differently near the hallway entrance. A slight displacement. The kind a human body creates simply by standing in a space and breathing. Someone was already in this apartment. They had been there the whole time. And they had let him walk in, set his bag down, touch their furniture and cross their floor without making a single sound. A deep voice came from the darkness ahead of him. Low, unhurried, absolute. You have exactly 10 seconds to explain why you're in my home. Keshaun Viremont had not moved in 11 minutes. He had come home at midnight, as he often did, through the private elevator that opened directly into his penthouse. No lobby interaction. No small talk with building staff. He had loosened his tie somewhere between the 42nd and 53rd floor, tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, and stepped off the elevator expecting exactly what he always found waiting for him. Nothing. Clean space. Controlled quiet. The particular stillness of a home that belonged entirely to one person and had never been asked to accommodate anyone else. Instead, the elevator doors had opened to the soft sound of someone moving in his kitchen. Keshaun had not announced himself. He rarely did in moments of uncertainty. A man in his position, 41 years old, head of Viremont Capital Group, a name that made lawyers uncomfortable and regulators careful, had survived this long by collecting information before revealing presence. He had stepped off the elevator silently, left his jacket on the console table near the entrance without a sound, and moved to the edge of the main hallway. What he saw stopped him completely. The intruder was not moving the way intruders moved. There was no urgency, no quick hands, no darting eyes scanning for valuables or exits. The young man in his kitchen was moving slowly, deliberately, with both hands extended slightly from his sides, fingertips brushing the countertop edge as he walked parallel to it. He set a paper grocery bag down on the counter and reached into it carefully, placing each item with a kind of precision that had nothing to do with stealth and everything to do with navigation. Then Keshaun saw the cane, resting against the kitchen island. And the understanding arrived without ceremony. He wasn't watching a thief. He was watching someone who had absolutely no idea whose home this was. Keshaun had remained where he was, watching, processing, running through the sequence rapidly the way he processed every situation. Information first, reaction second. Someone was in his penthouse. They were blind based on every behavioral indicator he had just observed. They had groceries. They had a cane. They appeared to believe, completely and without question, that they were somewhere they were supposed to be. That last part was the problem, because it meant someone had let them in, or told them they could be here. He watched the young man move out of the kitchen and begin crossing the living room. He moved with a kind of quiet focus that Keshaun found unexpectedly difficult to look away from. Careful, precise, each step measured but not fearful. The cane swept in small arcs, not frantically but methodically, like someone reading a sentence they already half knew. And then the intruder had stopped, turned his head, and Keshaun had understood that he had been detected. Not seen. Detected. The way you detect a change in barometric pressure or a shift in wind direction. Something instinctive and exact. He spoke. The young man did not run, did not stumble backward, did not make the panicked, lurching movement that most people made when a voice came at them from the dark unexpectedly. He exhaled once, slowly, through his nose. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a folded set of papers. He held them out in Keshaun's direction. "My name is Aurelian Quill," he said. His voice was even, calm in the way that calm is when it has been practiced out of necessity rather than arrived at naturally. "I have a signed lease for Unit 8400 in this building. I have a payment receipt for the deposit. And I have the broker's contact information, though I'll tell you right now he has not returned any of my calls in the last 48 hours. Keshaun crossed the room. He took the papers. He read them under the ambient light from the city windows, scanning each page with the focused efficiency of someone who had reviewed thousands of contracts. The lease was convincing. The building letterhead was almost correct. The unit number, 8400, matched this penthouse, not because this was unit 8400, but because someone had specifically typed that number onto a fraudulent document and attached this address to it. Someone had rented out his home to a stranger and taken the money. Keshaun set the papers down on his side table without a word and looked at Aurelian Quill more carefully. The young man was still holding his cane, still standing with that particular stillness, the kind that wasn't passive but attentive. His face was angled slightly to the right of where Keshaun actually stood, adjusted by sound rather than sight. There was a violin case near the front wall, a single travel bag, the grocery items on the counter. That was everything. That was the sum total of what this person had brought with him. Keshaun understood immediately. This man had spent real money to get here, money he probably could not recover. And he had moved in at midnight to avoid disturbing neighbors. Not because he was hiding. Because he was considerate. Because he had thought about the people around him before he thought about himself. Keshaun stood in the center of his own living room and felt something he was not used to feeling. Something adjacent to discomfort. Not because a stranger was in his space, but because the stranger was clearly, obviously, completely innocent. And Keshaun had spent enough years in rooms full of guilty people to recognize the difference instantly. Aurelian spoke again, quieter this time. "If I've made a mistake, I can leave tonight. I'll find somewhere." Keshaun looked at the grocery bag on his counter, then at the violin case by the wall, then at the young man standing in the middle of the room, still and composed, waiting for a verdict he could not see coming. He said it before he finished deciding it. "No. Stay." The word landed in the room and neither of them moved. Keshaun turned away first and walked back toward the hallway. He didn't explain himself. He never did. But somewhere between the kitchen counter and the living room floor, something had shifted, and Keshaun Viremont, who built his entire life around predicting what came next, had absolutely no idea what that was. 3 weeks passed. Aurelian counted them by routines rather than dates. The morning coffee Keshaun made without asking. Dark roast, no sugar, left on the kitchen counter at exactly 6:47 every day without a word. The sound of the private elevator arriving between midnight and 1 a.m., signaling a return home. The way the apartment changed in the hour before Keshaun arrived. Something in the air pressure, something in the way the ventilation system responded to the building's activity. That Aurelian had learned to read the way other people read shadows shifting under a door. He had not left, and Keshaun had not asked him to. That was the strange part. Not strange in a frightening way. Strange in the way that an unexpected act of kindness is strange when you have learned not to expect it. It sat in the center of Aurelian's chest and stayed there, warm and slightly uncomfortable, like something he hadn't been given permission to trust yet. He had reorganized his understanding of the space over the first 4 days. The penthouse was large, significantly larger than any place he had ever lived. He had mapped it the way he mapped all new spaces. Methodically, systematically, walking each room at reduced speed with one hand trailing the wall, counting steps between landmarks, cataloging the sound quality in each area so he could distinguish by echo alone whether he was near the kitchen, the hallway, the main window wall, or the open living room. By the 5th day, he moved through it without hesitation. Keshaun had noticed. Aurelian could tell by the way the man's footsteps changed when he was observing. A slight pause, a shift in weight, a silence that was attentive rather than absent. Aurelian had lived his whole life being watched by people who assumed watching was polite. Keshaun watched differently, less like curiosity, more like calculation, more like someone running a quiet assessment and choosing not to share the results. They existed around each other in a strange geometry. Mornings. Keshaun left before Aurelian was fully awake. Evenings. Aurelian was usually in the second bedroom he had quietly claimed, working at his portable audio station, headphones on, cleaning damaged recordings for the 3 music archives that still hired him. Late nights. Keshaun returned, moved through the apartment, and occasionally the two of them occupied the kitchen simultaneously without planning to. Those were the moments Aurelian had started paying attention to, because Keshaun Viremont did not do small talk. That was clear. He did not ask questions he wasn't interested in the answers to. He did not fill silence with noise the way most people did, reflexively, compulsively, as if quiet was something to be afraid of. When he spoke, it was direct, specific, and occasionally, without any warning, honest in a way that landed harder than Aurelian expected. 3 nights ago, Keshaun had sat at the kitchen island while Aurelian reheated leftovers. They had not spoken for nearly 15 minutes. Then Keshaun had said, without context, "You hum when you're processing audio." Aurelian had paused. "I know. I try to keep it quiet." "You don't need to." That was the whole conversation. But Aurelian had thought about it for 3 days. He cooked in the evenings partly because he needed to eat and partly because cooking was one of the things he did well and visibly, something that required competence and produced a result that a sighted person could recognize. It was not performed. It was practical. But he was aware that sharing food in a space you were not entirely sure you belonged in was its own kind of statement, and he made it carefully. Loneliness doesn't always look empty. Sometimes it looks like 2 people pretending not to notice each other. He had thought that watching the city through a window he couldn't see but could feel, the heat of it in the afternoon, the vibration of a living thing just beyond the glass. Keshaun's apartment faced south. He had worked that out by the warmth pattern. Full afternoon light on the right side wall of the living room, fading toward the left as evening moved in. He was thinking about that, standing near the window after dinner, when he heard Keshaun's voice from the other room, not speaking to him, on the phone. The words were controlled but sharp, and Keshaun was not a man who let sharpness into his voice without reason. "I don't care what the filing says. The acquisition was structured to displace current tenants before the rezoning vote. That is fraud, Marsh, and you know it." A pause. "No. I want the full record of every unit that changed hands in that building, and I want to know who signed off on the broker licenses." Another pause, shorter this time. "Then find someone who does know." The call ended. Aurelian stood completely still by the window. He replayed the words carefully. Acquisition, displacement, broker licenses, fraud. He didn't move immediately. He pressed the words against what he already knew. A broker who had disappeared with his deposit. A lease document that was almost convincing. A building whose front staff had looked at his paperwork too long. The shape of something ugly began to form. He turned it over in his mind slowly, the way he turned over a damaged recording, listening for what was broken underneath the surface noise. And what he heard beneath those phone call words was his own name. Not spoken, but present. Because whatever scheme had placed a false lease in his hands and walked him into this penthouse, it was not a random error. It was a system, and systems did not create single victims. Systems produced patterns. He had not been unlucky. He had been used. He crossed to the couch and sat carefully, hands folded, and tried to figure out how deep the water was before deciding whether to speak. He was still sitting there when the sound from the other end of the hallway reached him. Keshaun's phone buzzed. Once. Then the man went completely still, the particular stillness of someone reading something that changes the temperature of a room. Aurelian waited. After a long moment, Keshaun's footsteps came toward the living room, stopped at the entrance. "You should know," Keshaun said slowly, "that I'm going to need you to stay exactly where you are for the next few days. Don't go out alone." Aurelian turned his head toward him. "Why?" A beat of silence. And in that silence Aurelian heard everything Keshaun was choosing not to say yet. The document arrived at 11:43 p.m. Keshaun read it twice, then a third time. Not because he hadn't understood it the first time, he had. Completely. Immediately. He read it twice more because he was making absolutely certain that what he understood was what was actually written, and not some version of it his mind had constructed out of the pieces he'd already been collecting for the past 72 hours. What was written was worse than what he had suspected. The company was called Meridian Asset Solutions. On paper, it was a mid-level commercial property management firm, one of 47 such firms with some peripheral relationship to Viremont Capital Group's real estate portfolio. Keshaun did not manage those relationships directly. He had executives for that. He had department heads and compliance officers and legal teams specifically so that he did not have to personally review the operational ethics of every subsidiary with whom his firm did business. That structure, he was now understanding, had been used against him. Meridian was not a property management firm. It was a housing displacement engine. The investigator's report was thorough. Over 18 months, Meridian had executed a systematic pattern. Identify rental buildings in pre-gentrification zones. Insert fraudulent leases for luxury units in neighboring high-value properties. Collect deposits from vulnerable renters, low-income, elderly, disabled, and vanish before tenants realized the keys in their hands opened doors they were never authorized to enter. The resulting confusion created legal ambiguity. And legal ambiguity in real estate created windows. Windows during which actual tenants could be pressured to vacate. Buildings could be quietly acquired. Rezoning applications could be filed before anyone had organized enough to object. The broker who had handed Aurelian Quill a key to Keshaun's penthouse was named Devereux Marsh Jr., not the same Marsh on Keshaun's legal team. He'd already verified that. A different man. Connected to Meridian through 3 layers of shell company registrations that had taken his investigator 16 hours to untangle. Devereux Marsh Jr. had collected Aurelian's deposit. $1,400. Keshaun had more than that in loose cash in his office drawer. To Aurelian Quill, it had been everything he had saved. Keshaun set the report on his desk and turned his chair to face the window. Manhattan spread out below him in its permanent state of illuminated motion. He had looked at this view thousands of times and found it clarifying. It reminded him of scale, the scale of what he had built, what he controlled, what he understood. Tonight it looked different. Not smaller exactly, but complicated in a way it had not been before. He had not built Meridian, but capital from Viremont Group had moved through structures that enabled it. He had not targeted Aurelian Quill, but the system he had profited from had. That was not an argument he could use in public. He knew that. He had spent enough time in courtrooms and boardrooms to understand exactly how culpability worked and how it was argued. He was not legally responsible for what Meridian had done. That was not the same thing as not being responsible. He stood up, moved to the door of his office, and stood in the hallway for a moment. From the living room, he could hear the quiet sound of Aurelian working. The delicate, almost inaudible hiss of audio playback through professional headphones. The occasional tap of a keyboard. He had watched Aurelian work twice now from a distance. The way the young man moved through a task, methodical, unhurried, exact, was unlike almost anyone Keshaun had encountered in professional environments. No wasted motion, no performance, just a person doing the work required. Keshaun moved to the living room entrance and stood there. Aurelian was at the small folding table he had set up near the east wall, headphones around his neck, fingers working across a portable mixer board. He had a vinyl record on a small stand to his left, damaged, from the look of the edge, and an audio waveform running on a braille display tablet beside it. He was repairing something, completely unaware that the world around him was moving in a direction that had his name written into it. The threat message had come at 9:17 p.m. Unknown number. Routed through 2 relay services, which told Keshaun exactly what kind of operation was on the other end of it. The message had said 6 words. Remove the Omega or the scandal becomes public. Keshaun had read it, set his phone face down on his desk, and spent the next 40 minutes running every possible interpretation of those 6 words against everything he knew. What he landed on was simple and unpleasant. Whoever was running Meridian had realized that Aurelian's fraudulent placement in this specific penthouse, Keshaun's penthouse, created a liability. If it became public that a disabled, low-income Omega had been scammed into living in a billionaire's home under a forged lease, and that billionaire had known about it and said nothing for 3 weeks, the story wrote itself. And the story would attract exactly the kind of attention that tended to pull other stories out of hiding. They wanted Aurelian gone. Not because of who Aurelian was, because of what his presence proved. Keshaun walked back to his office, sat down, pulled up the contact for his lead investigator and typed 2 sentences. I need everything on Meridian Asset Solutions. Not a summary. Everything. He sent it. Then he pulled out a separate phone, secondary line, encrypted, and began making a different kind of call entirely. The kind of call that happened before decisions became public. The kind that determined whether a system fell quietly or loudly. He had not yet decided which way he wanted it to fall. But the moment he thought of Aurelian's $1,400 sitting in a vanished broker's account somewhere, he decided, loudly, something had changed in the apartment. Aurelian felt it the way he felt most things, not through any single signal but through the accumulation of small ones that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. Keshaun came home earlier now. Not dramatically earlier, but enough. The elevator arrived at 10:30 instead of midnight. He moved through the apartment with shorter steps, which meant he was not fully decompressed the way he usually was by the time he reached home. He made fewer phone calls out loud and more in what Aurelian had come to recognize as his office. The room at the far north end of the penthouse where the sound shifted and the distance swallowed his words before they reached the living room. The building itself was different too. This was harder to explain to someone who hadn't learned to read a building's sounds the way Aurelian had. But structures communicated constantly. Elevator frequency. The pattern of doors opening and closing on certain floors. The subtle change in lobby acoustics when security density increased. More bodies, more equipment, a slightly different ambient texture. He had noticed it first 4 days ago. Yesterday it was unmistakable. There were more people in this building who were not residents. He had said nothing. He was still working out what he knew from what he suspected, running the calculation carefully, because he had learned that speaking too early about a half-formed conclusion was more dangerous than staying quiet. But the conversation he had overheard 3 nights ago sat in his chest like a stone. Acquisition, displacement, broker licenses, and then don't go out alone. Keshaun had said it without explaining why. Aurelian had not pushed. But that night, lying in the too-soft bed of the second bedroom with the city humming below him, he had arranged the pieces he had collected into a shape. The shape was not good. He was not just a mistake. He was evidence. The broker who had forged his lease had connected 2 things that were not supposed to be connected. A fraud network targeting vulnerable renters, and the home of the most powerful alpha in Manhattan's financial sector. Aurelian's presence here was a loose thread. And loose threads, in the kind of world Keshaun moved through, got cut. He spent the afternoon working, or trying to. He loaded 3 hours of damaged audio from a 1960s jazz session. Original quarter-inch tape transferred to digital, deteriorated in storage, and ran it through his cleaning process. Frequency analysis, noise floor mapping, manual region editing for the worst of the tape dropout sections. He was good at this work. He had always been good at it. Finding the music underneath the damage, isolating what was real from what was just noise, restoring something that had almost been lost forever. He found, around the 3rd hour, that he was thinking less about the jazz session and more about himself. He was the damaged recording. and something was trying to decide whether he was worth restoring or simply erasing. That thought arrived quietly and stayed. At 8 p.m., he took off his headphones and sat in the stillness of the apartment for a long time. Then he went to the second bedroom and began to pack. He moved carefully and without rushing. He had arrived with very little and had accumulated almost nothing since. The violin case, the travel bag, the folding audio station, which broke down into 4 components and fit into a padded case he kept under the bed. He found each item by feel and positioned it at the center of the bed for final organization. He told himself this was the right call. Keshaun had been generous. More than generous. He had allowed a stranger to stay in his home and had asked for nothing in return and had said nothing cruel or impatient in 3 weeks of close proximity, which was more than most people Aurelian had ever known could claim. But staying was now becoming a liability, for both of them. Whatever system had manufactured his presence here had not gone away. It was still watching. And Aurelian refused to be the reason something came down on a man who had chosen, for reasons Aurelian still did not fully understand, to be decent to him. He finished packing at 11:40 p.m. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Then he picked up the violin case in one hand, the travel bag strap in the other, and walked out of the room. He moved through the apartment for the last time the way he had learned it. East wall of the hallway, 14 steps to the corner, left turn, 8 steps to the living room, diagonal to the front entrance. He moved efficiently. He did not let himself pause at the kitchen counter where the coffee had appeared every morning without announcement. He did not let himself stand in the center of the living room and listen to the quality of the silence one more time. He reached the front door. He found the handle and stopped, not because anything blocked him physically. Because the air shifted, the particular displacement of a large body standing very close. Keshaun was already at the door, standing between Aurelian and the exit. In the dark of the penthouse, with the city light coming through the southern windows behind him, Aurelian could not see him, but he could feel exactly how close he was. The warmth of him, the stillness of a man who had been standing there for longer than a moment, which meant he had known, had heard the packing, had chosen when to position himself. Aurelian did not step back. He stood with the violin case and the travel bag and waited. Keshaun did not move. For 4 full seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Keshaun said, low and even, "Put the bag down," and something in his voice, not a command exactly, but something heavier and quieter than that, something that sounded almost like asking, made Aurelian's grip loosen on the handle before he had consciously decided to let go. The bag hit the floor before Aurelian finished deciding to let it. That was the part that stayed with him afterward. Not Keshaun's words, not the low weight of his voice in the dark, but the fact that his own hands had responded before his mind caught up, as if some part of him had already made a choice his rational self was still arguing about. He stood at the door, bag on the floor, violin case still in his left hand. Keshaun had not moved. He was close enough that Aurelian could feel the warmth coming off him, the specific warmth of a large body that had been standing tense for longer than it wanted to admit. Alpha pheromones in the air, not aggressive, contained. The way a fire is contained when it's behind glass. Present, controlled, but real. Aurelian set the violin case down carefully. "I'm making it worse by being here," he said. "You know that." A pause. "I know the opposite," Keshaun said. That was not the answer Aurelian had prepared for. He stood very still and waited for the rest of it. Because there was a rest. He could hear it in the way Keshaun breathed, the slight adjustment that happened when someone was moving toward something they did not normally move toward. Not lying, not performing, actually working up to honesty, which in Aurelian's experience was significantly harder for powerful people than for anyone else. Keshaun walked past him, not away to the left, toward the living room, the sound of it, footsteps, then the soft weight of someone sitting at the kitchen island was an invitation. Aurelian followed. He found his usual stool by sound and sat. And Keshaun told him, all of it, not quickly, not like a confession. Keshaun Viremont was not a man built for confessions. He laid it out the way he probably laid out a legal document or a financial disclosure. Structured, sequential, each piece placed where it belonged before the next one arrived. Meridian Asset Solutions, the broker network, the pattern of fraudulent leases used to destabilize tenants in pre-acquisition buildings. The shell companies, the deposit money collected from dozens of people across the city. Elderly residents, people on fixed incomes, disabled individuals who had been specifically targeted because their circumstances made them less likely to pursue legal recourse. Aurelian sat and listened and did not interrupt. He heard his own story inside Keshaun's words. The $1,400 he had spent 4 months saving. The broker who had returned 3 calls before going permanently silent. The lease document that had felt almost right, almost in the specific way that a replica of something feels almost right, close enough to pass a first check but wrong in the way that only becomes clear when you know what you're looking for. He had not been unlucky. He had been selected. Pause on that. Selected. Because someone had looked at his profile. Blind, low-income, freelance, no family network in the city, and calculated the probability that he would have the resources or connections to fight back. They had been right. He wouldn't have. Not alone. Keshaun stopped talking. The kitchen was quiet except for the ambient sound of the city below them and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Aurelian placed both hands flat on the counter. How many people? He asked. Confirmed cases in the report, 41. Probably more who didn't file anything. 41. And the people connected to this, they know about me. They sent a message. 6 days ago. Keshaun's voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger. The kind of weight a person carries when they've realized the structure they built has rooms they never walked through. They want you removed from this building. If you leave quietly, the story doesn't become public. Aurelian turned that over. Their story, he said. Or yours. Silence. Then, both. That honesty cost Keshaun something. Aurelian could hear it. Not in what he said but in the half-second delay before it arrived. The delay of a man choosing truth over position. Keshaun said it then. Quietly. With the kind of directness that only comes when performance has been set down completely. Power hides in systems. And sometimes you don't see the damage until someone innocent gets caught in it. Aurelian did not respond immediately. He sat with the words, turned them over, tested their weight. Then he said simply, then expose them. The kitchen went still. Keshaun said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, careful, carrying the full weight of what the answer actually meant. Doing that could destroy everything I've built. The city hummed below them. Neither of them moved. And the question that sat between them now was not whether Keshaun could expose the network. It was whether he would. Aurelian did not raise his voice. He had learned a long time ago that volume was not the same thing as force. People who needed to be loud were usually covering something. Uncertainty, fear, the sense that their words would not carry on their own. He had never had that problem. When you had spent a lifetime making yourself understood without the help of eye contact, facial expression, or the physical presence most people used to command a room, you learned to put everything into the words themselves. He turned on the stool to face Keshaun directly. He could not see him, but he knew exactly where he was by sound, by warmth, by the subtle shift of air that had become as readable to Aurelian over the past 3 weeks as a face. You want to tell me, Aurelian said, that you built something worth protecting, and that burning it down to expose a fraud network is too high a price. A beat. I'm not telling you anything yet, Keshaun said. You don't have to. I can hear what you're weighing. The silence that followed was not defensive. It was the silence of someone who had been accurately read and was deciding how to respond to that. Aurelian leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the counter. I'm not going to tell you what to do, he said. I don't have that right. You didn't put me in this situation and you didn't build that network. So this is not my call to make. A pause. Intentional. But I'll tell you what I know about living invisible. He didn't wait for permission. When you can't be seen, not really seen, not in the way that counts, you learn fast that the world has two kinds of powerful people. The ones who use that invisibility against you, and the ones who choose not to. He stopped. Let that breathe for a moment. The system that targeted me, that targeted 41 people, it works because the powerful stay quiet. Not because they built it. Not always. But because silence is easier than exposure. And exposure costs more than most people are willing to pay. His voice stayed level. He was not accusing. He was not performing outrage. He was simply, carefully, laying out what he knew the way he laid out a damaged recording. Finding the real signal underneath all the noise and presenting it clearly. I survived every apartment I ever lost, he said. Every broker who vanished. Every landlord who sold without notice. I survived it because I had no other choice. But 41 people should not have to survive something that someone in this room has the power to stop. The kitchen was completely quiet. Keshaun had not moved. Aurelian leaned back and folded his hands. You're not asking me what happens to me if you do this, he said. I noticed that. A moment passed. Then Keshaun said, quietly, what happens to you if I burn my empire exposing this? Aurelian almost smiled. Not fully. Just the edge of it. I'll survive, he said. I always do. The words arrived simply. Without drama. Without the performance of bravery. Just a plain fact delivered by someone who had tested it enough times to know it was true. The quiet between them was different now. Not the quiet of two people avoiding something. The quiet of two people who had just crossed from one place to another and were standing in the new space trying to understand what it felt like. Keshaun exhaled once. Short. Controlled. I need you to understand something, he said. Aurelian waited. I didn't let you stay because I felt sorry for you. The words landed carefully. I stayed because I couldn't find a reason to make you leave that had anything to do with you. The kitchen held those words for a long moment. Aurelian turned his face slightly toward the window. The warmth of the city below came through the glass. Steady. Distant. A world that moved whether they made a decision or not. Then make the decision that lets you live with who you are, he said quietly. Not the one that protects what you've built. He stood up from the stool. He walked back toward the bedroom without another word. Because some things, once said, did not need to be followed. They needed to be felt. And behind him, in the kitchen, Keshaun Viremont sat completely still for a very long time. The story broke on a Tuesday. Keshaun had not sent it to a reporter. He had not held a press conference or issued a statement through legal counsel. What he had done quietly, precisely, over the course of 6 days, was deliver a complete package of internal documents, financial records, shell company registrations, broker license trails, and deposit transaction records to the Office of the Manhattan District Attorney, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, and one investigative journalist at the Times whose track record on financial crime Keshaun had reviewed personally before making contact. He had not warned anyone inside his own organization. Not the board. Not legal. Not communications. Because the leak would have come from one of those places. He had done it alone at 2 a.m. in his office with the city spread out below him and the penthouse behind him quiet in the way it had become quiet. Not empty quiet, but occupied quiet, the kind of space develops when more than one person has been living in it long enough to leave an impression. The story ran on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, it had been picked up by every major financial outlet in the country. By Friday, 3 executives at Meridian Asset Solutions had resigned. 2 others had retained criminal defense attorneys. The broker network, 17 individuals operating across 4 boroughs under various shell entity names, had been identified by name in a federal filing. Arrest warrants were pending. Devereux Marsh Jr. was picked up at LaGuardia attempting to board a flight to Cancun. The deposit money, not just Aurelian's $1,400 but the collective deposits of 43 confirmed victims, had been frozen in accounts that investigators were now actively tracing. None of that was the part that cost Keshaun the most. The part that cost him was the board response. 3 of his 7 board members called within the first 48 hours. Not to congratulate him. Not to express concern about the victims. to express concern about the firm's exposure, about the optics of a Viremont Capital executive providing documentation that implicated a business partner, about the shareholder implications of appearing to cooperate with a federal investigation rather than defend against one. One board member, a man named Harrington Foyle who had been on Keshaun's board for 11 years, said specifically, "You've handed them a weapon, Keshaun, and they're going to use it whether you're the hero in this story or not." Keshaun had listened to all of it. Then he had ended the calls, and he had watched, over the following week, as 3 major investment partners quietly paused their partnerships with Viremont Capital Group pending review. One real estate developer, a man Keshaun had been closing a 9-figure deal with for 8 months, sent a single email through counsel withdrawing from negotiations without explanation. The empire did not collapse, but it fractured. That was the honest word for it. Not destroyed, fractured. Along lines that had existed for years but had been held together by the pressure of silence. Now the silence was gone, and the pressure was redistributed, and the lines showed. Keshaun sat at his desk on the 7th evening and looked at the damage assessment his CFO had submitted. He read every number. He did not look away from any of them. And when he was done, he set the report aside and sat very still. Because here was the thing about losing something large. And this mattered, it really did. The loss revealed what the thing had actually been. Not what you said it was. Not what you built it to represent. What it actually was. And what Keshaun discovered, sitting in the wreckage of a partially fractured empire, was that a significant portion of what he had built had been scaffolded on the assumption that silence was the same thing as integrity. It was not. Silence was just quiet. Integrity was the thing you chose when quiet was no longer an option. The news coverage praised the whistleblower extensively. None of the coverage named him. His investigator had structured the document delivery carefully. There were no fingerprints that a standard investigation would connect back to Keshaun without effort. He was anonymous. The fractured empire was real. The anonymity was real. And the 43 people who would get their deposits back, that was real too. He stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the city. Then he went to find Aurelian. The second bedroom was empty. Clothes gone. Audio equipment gone. The folding table he had set up against the east wall left a faint rectangular impression in the rug where it had sat for 3 weeks. On the kitchen counter, there was a single folded note. Keshaun picked it up. He opened it. For words, written in large, careful capital letters, the handwriting of someone who wrote by feel and measured precision rather than sight. "Thank you. Survive well." Keshaun stood at the counter for a long time. Then he looked at the address on the note's outer fold. Aurelian had written it there, probably assuming Keshaun would need it for some administrative purpose. A forwarding address. Contact information for victim advocacy coordination. Something practical. Keshaun folded the note carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. The studio apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Bed-Stuy. Real stairs. Real noise. Pipes that knocked every morning at 6 a.m. like a resident who had given up sleeping and wanted company. The lock took 2 tries every time. The window faced north and got almost no direct light, which would have bothered most people and did not bother Aurelian at all. It was his, actually his, verified lease. Physical walkthrough with the landlord before signing. Deposit paid to a registered property management company with an actual office address and a phone number that answered. He had spent an afternoon mapping it. 11 steps from the front door to the kitchen. 7 from the kitchen to the bedroom. The bathroom was small enough that he could orient himself from the door without any additional navigation required. There was a radiator in the corner of the main room that ticked warmly in the evenings and had become, within a week, as familiar and expected as anything he had known for years. He rebuilt his routines carefully. Audio work in the mornings. 2 new clients. A university music archive in Philadelphia and a private collector in Atlanta who had boxes of deteriorated reel-to-reel tapes from the 1950s. The work was good. Steady. The kind that required complete attention and rewarded it, which was the combination that worked best for him. In the evenings he cooked. Listened to the building settle around him. played violin for an hour before bed. Not perfectly, not always, but consistently, which was what mattered. He did not think about the penthouse. He thought about it constantly. Not with longing exactly. Something more precise than that. The way you think about a period of your life that was abnormal and contained and entirely unlike everything before and after it. Not because it was better, but because something real happened there. Something that did not fit into any category he already had. He thought about the coffee on the counter every morning. He thought about Keshaun saying you don't need to keep it quiet after the humming observation. The specific weight of those 5 words. Not reassurance exactly. More like permission. The kind that came from someone who had observed carefully and arrived at a conclusion and delivered it without wrapping it in anything soft. He thought about the kitchen at 2 a.m. and what it had felt like to say, "I'll survive. I always do." And know, for the first time in a long time, that someone was actually listening. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. He stopped counting after that. On a Thursday evening in late November, he was working at his audio station when the knock came. He heard it and did not move immediately. His building knocked in specific ways. The super announced himself with 2 fast knocks followed by a pause. His downstairs neighbor knocked once and then twice when he needed help with deliveries. The mailman buzzed the intercom, never the door directly. This knock was 3 times. Even, unhurried. He had not heard it before. But he recognized the rhythm of it. The same way you recognize a voice you have not heard in weeks. Not because it is distinctive, but because it belongs to someone whose entire presence, including the way they occupied silence, had become familiar to you without your permission. Aurelian set down his headphones, stood up. He crossed the apartment in 11 steps, found the door handle, opened it. The warmth of a large body standing close. The scent of cedar, cold iron underneath it. And something underneath that, something newer, less controlled, something that had not been present before and that Aurelian could not name but understood immediately. Vulnerability. Keshaun was standing outside his apartment door. Aurelian could feel him adjusting, taking in the difference between the building they were in now and the one they had shared, taking in the real stairs and the knocked pipes and the window with no southern light. In Keshaun's hands, held out carefully, as if the offering was the only prepared part of the visit, was something small, wooden, precisely shaped. Aurelian's fingers found it by instinct. A violin bridge, old wood, repaired at the base with a clean joint and fresh finish. The violin bridge that had cracked during his move and that he had set aside in a small tray on the kitchen counter of the penthouse 3 weeks ago. He had forgotten it, or maybe he had left it. He turned it over in his fingers. Then Keshaun said it low, with the kind of quiet that was not distance but its opposite. "I realized something after losing everything." Aurelian did not move. The hallway was still. The building ticked around them. He waited. Neither of them moved. The hallway held them both in its particular stillness, the kind that forms when 2 people have arrived at the edge of something and are standing there together, each waiting for the other to speak first and neither willing to let the moment collapse into something smaller than it was. Keshaun spoke, not with the voice he used in boardrooms, not the voice that ended calls and redirected attorneys and calculated outcomes before responding. Something underneath that voice. Something that had been underneath it for a while, probably, and had simply never had a reason to come to the surface before. "The night you left," he said, "I found the note, and then I stood in that kitchen for about 20 minutes looking at an empty counter." He stopped, adjusted. "I built that penthouse to be the kind of place that proved something. About what I had. About what I could control. A beat. I had not once cooked in that kitchen. In 4 years. Aurelian listened without speaking. "You cooked in it the second evening. Without asking." Keshaun's voice shifted slightly. Not softer, but more direct. "You mapped every room like you were memorizing something worth keeping. You hummed over audio files at 2 in the morning. You had an opinion about every meal you made and never explained it unless someone asked." He paused again. Then, "I didn't expose that network because it was the right thing to do." Aurelian's head came up slightly. "I mean, it was. But that was not what made me do it at midnight instead of putting it through legal channels and waiting 6 months. Keshaun's voice carried no performance in it now. This was the sound of a man finishing a thought he had been working on for weeks. I did it at midnight because I had been sitting in that kitchen after you walked away, and I understood something I had not understood once in 41 years. He said it plainly. I was lonely. Not in the way that can be fixed by a full schedule or a larger portfolio or the right investment close. Lonely in the way where you've arranged the whole of your life to look like it doesn't need anything, and one person walks in who needs it to be a home, and you realize you've been treating a home like a statement. Aurelian's fingers were still wrapped around the repaired violin bridge. The wood was warm from Keshaun's hands. He felt, in the small carved shape of it, the entire weight of what had been said. Not just the words, the cost of them, the specific cost of honesty for someone who had built an empire on never being exposed. Aurelian stepped back from the door. An invitation, not a word spoken, just a step, and the specific quality of it, deliberate, unhurried, that said more than a sentence could. Keshaun entered. Aurelian heard him take in the apartment. The real stairs, the ticking radiator, the modest kitchen with the 2 burners and the cutting board that fit against the counter only if you angled it correctly. He did not apologize for it. He did not explain it. It was his, and it worked, and that had always been enough. He led Keshaun to the small table near the window. They sat. And then Aurelian said what he had been carrying since he left. I didn't forget that violin bridge by accident. Silence. I left it because I needed a reason to believe someone would bring it back. He kept his voice level, factual. Not because I thought you would. I didn't think that. But because I needed to want something to be true badly enough to leave the door open for it. The radiator ticked in the corner. Rain had started somewhere in the last hour. The same particular rain that had been present the night all of this began, soft and persistent, tapping the window with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. Keshaun reached across the table. His hand found Aurelian's. Not the violin bridge, not the wrist, but the hand itself. Directly, without hesitation. The way you reach for something when you have finally stopped calculating whether reaching is a good idea. Aurelian turned his palm up and held on. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, not needing to. The rain did the talking for them. Steady and even and covering the city in the same quiet it had offered the night a blind Omega had followed a fraudulent key into a penthouse and the most guarded man in Manhattan had said, for reasons he did not yet understand, no, stay. He understood now, and so did Aurelian. The strange thing about mistakes, Aurelian said finally quietly, is that sometimes they aren't mistakes at all. Sometimes they're doors you never would have opened on purpose. Keshaun said nothing. He didn't have to. His hand stayed where it was. And for the first time in longer than either of them could accurately name, neither of them was alone. The rain kept falling. The city kept moving below them. And the apartment, small, real, warm, entirely imperfect, held them both without effort. The way a home is supposed to.